Willis is disqualified. There would still be a process to salvage the election interference case. If Willis is removed, she can file an appeal. But if that is denied, a new prosecutor would take over the Trump investigation entirely. Multiple stakeholders, including Georgia Governor Brian Kemp, Attorney General Chris Carr, and Pete Scalandalakis, is of prosecuting the Attorney's Council. They would all determine who would step in. Atlanta Attorney Joshua Schiffer, says this is a very real possibility.
Both her performance and Mr. Wade's were easily considered evasive. I don't believe they answered the questions forthrightly and straightforward in a way that you would expect from people charged with such an important job. And I think it will be very hard for Judge McAfee to ignore that when he considers whether to disqualify or not. By removing the district attorney's office, you eliminate a lot of the theoretical stain people are talking about when it comes to the legitimacy of any conviction that would flow.
A new prosecutor would have the option to prosecute like Willis's office initially planned, or choose not to prosecute altogether. We'll be covering tomorrow's court appearance. You can watch DA Willis's full testimony on AtlantaNewsFirst.com. Download our app to get up-to-the-minute notifications about this very high-profile trial.